Hi class, this is the lecture for Chapter 7, CIT 171. This chapter we're going to be covering user creation and management. This is a fairly short chapter. There's not a whole lot to the user creation and management. You can get fairly in depth with it, but in this chapter we're going to keep it at a fairly high level in terms of the privileges and the different types of access or authorizations that you can apply to users in your Oracle database. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Again, this is a short chapter, so it shouldn't be long. So let's go. So the objectives of this chapter, just to go through them really quickly, we're going to learn how to create a new user account. So if you have an Oracle database, how to create a new user, the two types of privileges, system and object privileges, how to grant a privilege to a user, how to change your password for an existing account, what a role is, how to create a role, how to grant privileges to a role, and how to assign a user to that role. Also how to view the privilege information, and then how to basically undo everything that we just created. So how to revoke privileges, how to revoke a role from a user, how to remove a user, drop a role. So let's start out by talking really quickly about data security. So if you are a database administrator or DBA of an Oracle database, you are going to be the one who's primarily doing the create users and modifying the access for the users of the database. If you are a developer of an application that uses the Oracle database, you definitely are going to have a role or play a hand in defining what those privileges are, or what those user accounts are, and what they can or cannot have access to. So when you're developing your application, you may be working very closely with the DBA to set up users and roles and privileges for those users so that they can only do certain things in the application based on their job function. And the reason why we want to do it this way is for data security, so that we can take a user and say, okay, you can only see data for these specific tables. That way they don't have access to all the information that's out there. So we need to be able to grant access to these specific objects, such as tables, and then identify who the owners of those objects are. So if you have an orders table, for example, you may not want someone from a different department, from some other department, being able to access the orders, but you do want everyone that does the order entry to be able to access the orders table. So you need to define who the owners of those tables are and grant the access appropriately. So let's jump into our SQL Plus application, and we can go ahead and start creating users, and we'll walk through how to actually do this. So I'm going to open up SQL Plus, and I'm going to connect as my Scott user. And the basic syntax to create a user, or the basic command to create a user, is defined here in this PowerPoint presentation. So it's create user, and then the username you want it to be, identified by, and then the password. Now you guys have run this command before whenever we created the Scott user in one of the first couple of weeks whenever we were setting up the database. So you guys have done this before, so this should be a little bit of a review. But I'm going to go ahead and create a user, and I'm going to have the first initial of my first name and then my last name, so J. Bickett, and then I'm going to create a password identified by, and I'm going to say test123 is my password, end it with a semicolon. Oop, I guess I've already got this user created. Let me go ahead and drop this user really quickly. Okay, let's try this again. Create user, jbicket, identified by test 1, 2, 3. There we go. So user created. So that's the very basics, how to create a user. So now we have a user created called jbicket. Now, let's go ahead and try to connect with this user. So if I do connect jbicket, and I type in my password test 1, 2, 3, you'll notice it comes up with an error. It says user jbicket lacks the create session privilege, log on denied. Warning, you're no longer connected to Oracle. So it disconnected me from my previous session. But this is because our user, jbicket, does not have the create session privilege. So that is a privilege that the create session is a privilege that all users have to have in order to log onto the database. So it has to be there. And that type of privilege is known as a system privilege. So let's talk quickly about what privileges are. So there are two types of privileges in Oracle. There are system privileges, and then there are object privileges. The system privileges are going to allow us to allow the user to access the database, and then also execute DDL operations. So that's data definition language operations, such as creating a table, and things, and altering a table, and commands like that. So it's going to allow them to do those things. Then you have object privileges. So that's going to allow a user to perform DML and query operations. So DML, again, data manipulation language. So that's going to allow you to do things on a specific object, such as if you have a specific table, it's going to allow you to say, okay, this user can select, update, delete, insert onto this specific object or this specific table. So again, even with a valid username and password, a user still needs the create session privilege to connect to a database. So I'm going to need to grant the create session privilege to my user in order to be able to actually log on to the database. So I'm going to connect again as Scott. And this time, I'm going to run grant create session to jbicket. Now I've granted the create session privilege to the jbicket user, and now if I connect as jbicket, test 1, 2, 3, it allows me to connect. So that is a requirement for whenever you create a user, you always want to give them grant session if you're expecting them to be able to connect to the database. So system privileges, again, different than an object privilege. These allow a user to do DDL commands. So they affect the user's ability to create, alter, and drop objects. So if you need system privileges in order to do things like create a table, alter a table, drop a table. One key thing whenever you're doing system privileges is that you can use the any keyword, A-N-Y, any keyword, to do a system-wide privilege. So, for example, if you want to grant a privilege that is insert any table, so that is going to allow you to allow that user to insert data into any table system-wide in the database. So, and then you can, in Oracle I think there's over 200 or almost 200 different system privileges that you can actually grant to somebody. So there are quite a few. So if you want to see them all, you can list them in the system privilege map table. So if I select name from the system underscore privilege underscore map table. It's going to list all of the different system privileges that I can actually assign to a user. So you can see some of them right here. For example, delete any table, update any table, alter any table. These are these are all of the system privileges that you can assign to a user. So, for example, if a question in your homework, for example, could say or could ask you to excuse me, could ask you to allow or assign a privilege to an account that will allow the user to create new tables and alter existing tables. So to alter an existing tables, you may want to grant that user alter any table privilege, and that way they can alter any table within the entire database. Likewise, you may want to grant them create table, which allows them to create a table in the database as well. So if you want to grant a system privilege, we just now walked through how to do create session. But again, here is the basic grant command. So you grant and then the system privilege name to the username or role name, which we'll talk about roles in a little bit, and you have an option to do with admin. With admin means that it allows any user or role identified in the to clause to grant the system privilege to any other database user. So if I gave with admin option to my user Jay Bickett, I could then grant this system privilege to another user within the database, for example. So usually you don't want to, are not going to want to do that. So again, grant the to clause and then with admin. So now let's talk about object privileges. So object privileges, again, when a user logs into a database, this allows them to do DML options against specific objects in the database, or in this case, a specific table, or view, or sequence. So if you want to grant someone or a user the select privilege, that you grant them that select privilege on a specific table, so that way they can select data from that specific table. Likewise with insert, update, delete, or alter. If you wanted to say this user can only update this table, they can't select data from it, they can't insert data into it, they can only update it, you can grant a user update to a specific table, and that's all that they can do on that table. You can also say, okay, they can only update specific columns or specific fields in the table as well. So you do have several options here. So here is the grant object syntax. So again, you can grant the object, and then you can also specify column names in here on the object name. So for example, grant select on orders. For example, if you wanted to grant select for the orders table to, and then the username. So again, the grant clause identifies the object privilege, such as select, insert, delete, update. The on clause identifies the object. The to clause identifies the user or role receiving the privilege. And then the with grant option gives the user the ability to assign the same privilege to other users, similar to the with admin option. So here are a couple of examples. So in this example, Ron Thomas needs to be able to select and insert rows into the customers table, which is in the Scott schema. So if you want to grant, select, and insert those two privileges on the Scott.customers table to the user R. Thomas. Here's an example where they can only select or update specific columns. So this user, they only want him to be able to update last name and first name on the customers table. So we're granting select and then update, and in parentheses next to the update we put the columns that they can update, last name, first name. Otherwise, by default, it's going to allow them to update any column on the specific object or table, and then to the user. Okay. So I'm going to hop over here back to SQL Plus really quickly, and I'm going to connect back as my Scott user. Wrong password. And I'm going to grant, let's say I will grant select, and then on the books table to J. Bickett. So now I've granted select onto J. Bickett. So if I connect back to as J. Bickett, test 1, 2, 3, I can select all from books. Let's see, the table review does not exist. So the reason why it says the table does not exist is because I have to specify the schema that I'm connecting to, so or that I'm trying to select from. So books is only available in the Scott schema. So whenever I select from this, I need to select from Scott.books. And there it is. So just again, the reason why it didn't come up the first time is because all of the tables in our Just Lead Books database were created under the Scott schema. So I have to specify that Scott schema when I select from that table. So if I wanted to update Scott.books, set the title equal to test, it's not going to let me. It says insufficient privileges. That's because I have not been granted the update privilege for this table. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense and shows you how to grant object privileges to a user. So again, two different types of privileges. We have system privileges that allow you to do DML options such as create tables, create sequences, create views, alter tables. So if you want to drop a column or add a column, allows you to do that. And you also have object privileges, which allow you to do DML. Excuse me, I said DML for the first. I meant DDL operations. You can do DML operations such as select, insert, update, delete to tables to a specific object with object privileges. Okay, so let's move on and let's talk really quickly about password management and how to change a password on a user. So if I wanted to change the password for J. Bickett, instead of test123, let's say I wanted it to be test321, all I need to do is alter user J. Bickett identified by, and I'm going to say test321 instead. So then I alter my user. So you guys won't be able to see this, but whenever I connect as J. Bickett, if I put in test123, it says invalid username or password. If I connect again and I say test321, it connects. So again, really simple. If you want to change the password for a user, you alter the user and say identified by and enter the new password. Okay, so let's move on to roles. So a role is a group or collection of privileges. So um, for example, you can see in the SQL here on this slide that they have created a role called order entry, and then they have granted different privileges such as select, insert, and update on different database objects. So they've granted those privileges for on the customers table, on the orders table, and on the order items table to the role order entry. So instead of assigning or granting those privileges, those object privileges, to a specific user, they have granted those roles to, granted those privileges to a role. And the reason we want to use roles is if you have a specific job function, for example, or job duties. For example, you may have someone who all they do is do order entry. Instead of having to go through and assign these privileges for each user for each table, you can group all of the privileges together and assign them to a role, and then all you have to do is assign that role to the user. So this makes it much more simple to manage all the privileges for users, especially when you group the access to your database by job function or by a specific type of user. So you can create all sorts of different roles and then assign, and all those roles have specific object privileges or system privileges rolled up into them, and then you can, when you assign those roles to a specific user, they automatically get all of the privileges that are assigned to that role. Hopefully that makes sense. It really simplifies when you want to manage what access a user has, because if you get a new person, a new employee that gets hired to do order entry, you can easily assign them a specific role, and you know they automatically have privileges to everything that they're supposed to have access to. So roles can be assigned to other users or other roles. So you can actually assign roles to other roles. We won't be doing that, but you can do that if it was necessary. So here is the syntax for granting that order entry role that was created on the previous slide to a specific user. So just like when you grant a privilege, you grant a role to a user. So let's go back really quickly here and I want to make sure you guys get this. I don't think I'm going to go through it on SQL+, but there's a two-step process here for roles. Number one, you have to actually create the role. So the role has to exist in the database. The second step is to begin granting privileges to that role. So you create the role, then you grant the privileges. Then the third step is you can grant that role to a specific user. Okay? So hopefully that's clear. So it's a three-step process. Again, create the role, grant privileges to that role, and then grant the role to a specific user. So utilizing roles, a user can be assigned to several roles. So again, you can give them lots of different roles, just like you can give them lots of individual privileges. All the roles can be enabled at one time. Only one role can be designated as the default role for each user. The default role can be assigned through the alter user command. So if you want, when you create a user, you can have a default role assigned so that anytime they log in, they always get some sort of default role. When we modify roles, just like altering a user, we alter the role. You do an alter role command, and that will alter the. That's where you can actually alter the role. You can also add a password, assign a password to a role. So if you had a role that had a lot of administrative privileges, you kind of can add an extra layer of security in there by forcing the user that's assigned that role to have to enter a password before the role is actually enabled. So that way, that sort of prevents if they accidentally, I guess, left their session logged in, and you had a disgruntled employee that came over and wanted to do something malicious, they would still have to enter a password in order to do some of the administrative things required by that role. So if you want to, so let's say you set up roles, you set up privileges for all of your users. If you want to be able to see those privileges, you need to use some of these system tables. So as an example, now your book lists a whole slew of views or tables. I guess they're views to see these roles or see these privileges. These two are two of the most important, or two that we will be using a lot. So the first one is role syspriv, so that lists all of the system privileges assigned to a role. So if I go in here, we'll connect to this JBicket, and I say select all from role sysprivs. I guess I don't have access to that. I think you have to be a DBA to select that. So let me connect to Scott. There we go. So let me scroll up here. Yeah, so there are a lot of them. So this shows the role, so this DBA role, and then it shows every privilege that's assigned for the DBA role. So the DBA role is going to have pretty much every privilege, so you can see them all listed here. There's also some other roles in here. I haven't created any roles on my database, so I don't see anything specific in here for us. But this is where you can see, if you wanted to filter this down and only see this IMP full database role, you could see all of the privileges for that role. The other table or view that you are going to use is the session from session privs. And what this will do is show you what privileges the current user has. And as you can see with my Scott user, I have a lot of them. So let me connect this JBicket S321. I don't believe you have to have DBA to view this one. It would help if I could type, select all from session privs. Okay, so there you go. So the only privilege that I have with this user is create session. So you may have a homework question where you need to list the privileges of the user, and that is how you do it. Select all from session privs. And again, your book has a table that shows all of these different views where you can see these the different privileges that are assigned, and also I believe it shows whether or not you need DBA access in order to view the information. Here's an example though of the role tab privs. So for the order entry role, for example, that was created in the earlier example, you can see that Because remember, we assigned insert, select, and update for 3 tables: customers, order items, and orders. So there you can see all of the privileges listed there. Now, if you want to remove a system privilege from a user, you want to use the revoke command. So the syntax is revoke whatever the system privilege is, for example, create session, from the user or role. So if you say revoke create session from JBicket, it's going to remove that from the user. So let me just connect as Scott, Tiger, and then revoke create session from JBicket. So now the revoke has succeeded, and if I try to connect with JBicket, I lack the create session privilege now, log on denied. So that's how you revoke a privilege. So if I revoke an object privilege, if the privilege was originally granted with grant option as a default, essentially, as granted with using with grant option, so they can do it for any other user as well, the effect cascades and is revoked from subsequent recipients. So if you granted that to anyone else, it's going to cascade and remove that object privilege. You can also revoke a role name. So if I wanted to revoke order entry from R. Thomas or whatever the user may be, I do it this way: revoke the role name from username R. Thomas. And then dropping a role. So if I wanted to drop the order entry role, I just say drop role order entry, and that the person. So if I had assigned a user this role, they no longer have the privileges that they were assigned via that role. And then last but not least, dropping a user. So if I wanted to drop JBicket, you guys saw me do this earlier in the session, but if I say drop user JBicket, drop user JBicket, the user's dropped. And so now if I try to connect this JBicket, it says it's an invalid username or password, login denied. So there is no more JBicket user in my database. So that is pretty much the end of it. So again, just as a quick review, we talked about how to create a user, and with the identified by clause, which is where you set the password. We talked about privileges, how there's our system privileges that allow the user to do DDL commands such as create table, alter table, drop table, so on different database objects. You also have the create session privilege, which is required to be able to log on to the Oracle database. You can view all the system privileges in the system privilege map table. Then you also have object privileges, which that allows you to grant DML commands such as select, update, insert, delete to specific objects on the database. So a user you can grant select on a specific table for a user. If you want to update the password, or if their password is about to expire, you can use the alter user and then use identified by clause to change their password again. And then we talked about roles and how you can create a role, grant privileges to that role, and then assign the role to a user, and then when that happens, they automatically get all of the privileges that are a part of that role. And then we also talked about how to revoke a role, how to drop a role, and then how to drop a user. So as always, if you guys have any questions regarding the chapter, please email me, and I will try to answer your questions as soon as possible. Good luck, and thanks for listening.